The air in the grand gallery, stripped bare of its former warmth, hummed with the electric malice of the industrial shredder. Julian Croft stood before the machine, a monument of gleaming chrome and brutalist angles, a fitting altar for his purge of the past. He despised sentiment, and this house, his late father's house, was suffocating in it. Every dusty canvas, every tarnished silver frame was a testament to a life lived in soft-focused nostalgia, a world Julian had rejected for the sharp, clean lines of profit and progress. His gloved hands lifted the last painting. It was a worthless thing, a portrait of some unknown woman, with sad eyes and a hopeful smile, rendered in the muted, apologetic tones his father had favored. The artist's signature was an illegible scrawl, the canvas yellowed with age. It was clutter, the final ghost to be exorcised. He fed the corner of the heavy gilt frame into the machine's hungry maw. The gears groaned, ready to bite. "Stop!" The voice was a silver bell in the cavernous room, so unexpected it felt like a hallucination. Julian flinched, turning. A small girl, no older than 8, with tangled brown hair and fierce, terrified eyes, stood at the gallery's entrance. Her dress was faded, her shoes worn, a stark splash of poverty against his sterile white marble. "Stop!" she cried again, her voice trembling but resolute. "You can't! That's my mommy!" The words hung in the air, absurd and impossible. Julian's first reaction was annoyance, a sharp spike of irritation at the breach in his security. How had a street urchin wandered into the gated grounds of the Croft estate? He let the frame slip from his grasp, the painting resting precariously against the shredder's teeth. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice flat and cold, the same voice he used to dismantle corporations and dismiss underlings. The girl didn't flinch. She took a hesitant step forward, her gaze locked on the portrait. Her hands were clenched into tiny, white-knuckled fists. "My name is Lily, and that's my mommy's picture. You can't break it." He scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "Your mother? I highly doubt that. This is a piece of junk that's been collecting dust for 30 years. He gestured dismissively at the painting, at its melancholy subject. The woman in the portrait was ethereal, lost in a world of her own, a stark contrast to the grubby, defiant child standing before him. "It's not junk," Lily insisted, her chin jutting out. "It's the most beautiful thing in the world. Mr. Arty said so." The name hit Julian like a physical blow. Mr. Arty. That's what the neighborhood kids had called his father, Arthur Croft. A man who preferred the company of paint-smudged children to his own son. The wave of resentment was so familiar, so potent, it almost choked him. He had spent his entire life trying to escape the shadow of his father's gentle, artistic, and in Julian's eyes, utterly ineffectual existence. "My father said a lot of things," Julian clipped, turning his back on her, intending to finish the job. The destruction of this last sentimental piece felt like a final severing of the cord. "He taught me how to mix the colors," Lily's voice piped up from behind him, clear and conversational, as if sensing his internal turmoil. "He showed me how the light in her hair isn't just yellow. It's got streaks of gold and caramel and even a little bit of green, like when the sun shines through leaves. He said you have to look past the first thing you see to find what's real." Julian froze, his hand hovering over the shredder's control panel. He had never looked at the painting. Not really. He'd seen a brown-haired woman, a drab background, a gilt frame. He'd seen his father's failure to embrace the modern world. He turned his head slowly, reluctantly, and let his eyes truly fall upon the canvas. He saw the woman's hair. And damn it all, the girl was right. Tucked within the sable waves were tiny, almost imperceptible threads of ochre, viridian, and brilliant gold, a subtle alchemy that gave the hair a living, breathing depth. He had owned the painting his entire life, and a child in rags had seen more in it in a single glance than he had in 40 years. The realization was unsettling. It pricked at the armor of his certainty. "He told you that?" Julian asked, his voice softer than he intended. Lily nodded, taking another cautious step into the room. She was like a small wild thing testing the air. "He told me everything. He said this house is full of secrets, but not bad ones, just quiet ones. Stories waiting for someone to listen." Julian's jaw tightened. Stories. His father had been full of them. Endless, rambling anecdotes about every chipped teacup and moth-eaten rug in this mausoleum. Stories that paid no bills, that built no empires. Stories that had stood in the way of a proper father-son relationship built on ambition and achievement. "There are no stories here," Julian said, the coldness returning. "Just things, and these things are being disposed of." He pressed the button. The shredder whirred to life with a deafening roar. Lily screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure anguish. She darted forward, impossibly fast, and threw her small body against the painting, wrapping her arms around the heavy frame as if to shield it. "No, please!" she sobbed, her face pressed against the dusty canvas. The machine's metal teeth were inches from her tangled hair. A vision flashed in Julian's mind, a newspaper headline, a scandal, his meticulously curated life shattered by a moment of callousness. But it was more than that. The girl's desperation was primal, absolute. It was a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. He slammed his hand on the emergency stop button. The shredder died with a final shuddering groan. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by Lily's ragged sobs. She was still clinging to the painting, her small frame trembling violently. Julian stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs, a strange and unfamiliar sensation. He was a man who controlled everything, yet this tiny, powerless child had brought his entire operation, his entire philosophy, to a screeching halt. He sank onto a nearby packing crate, the adrenaline leaving him feeling hollowed out. The girl, Lily, didn't move. She remained fused to the painting, her protector. He watched her for a long moment, the architect of a multi-billion-dollar empire, held hostage by an 8-year-old's tears. He should have called security. He should have had her removed, gently but firmly. He should have dismissed her as a confused, troubled child. But he couldn't. Her words about the colors in the hair, her casual mention of Mr. Artie, had unlocked a door in his mind he had long since bolted shut. "Why?" he finally asked, the words sounding rusted from disuse. "Why is this painting so important to you?" Lily lifted her head, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, fixed on his. "Because," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "it's all I have left of her." The simplicity of her statement was more powerful than any legal argument or emotional plea. It was a fundamental truth that resonated in the empty gallery, a truth that Julian, for all his wealth and power, couldn't refute. He had everything, and this girl had nothing but a dusty portrait his father had painted of her mother. A mother who was, by the girl's own admission, gone. "Where is your mother now?" Julian asked, his voice carefully neutral. Lily's face clouded over. She looked down, tracing the pattern on the worn sleeve of her dress. "She's away," she said vaguely. "She got sick. The coughing kind. The doctor said she needed special air. Clean air. They took her to a place in the mountains." It sounded like a story a child would be told to soften a harsher reality, but her belief in it was absolute. "And this painting," Julian prompted, gesturing toward it. "She left it behind?" Lily shook her head vehemently. "No. We had to leave our room fast. We couldn't take everything. But she told me Mr. Artie would keep it safe for us. She said he promised. She made me promise to check on it." So, his father was a glorified storage unit for the local poor. The thought was laced with his usual cynicism, but it lacked its customary bite. Arthur Croft had made a promise to a sick woman and her child, and he, Julian, had been about to shatter that promise into 1,000,000 pieces. The weight of that near transgression settled on him, heavy and uncomfortable. He looked around the gallery, at the empty spaces on the walls where other paintings had once hung. He'd sold them off, masterpieces by minor impressionists, landscapes by forgotten artists. He'd gotten good prices for them, but now, for the first time, he wondered about their stories. Had his father promised to keep them safe, too? "And my father? Mr. Artie? You knew him well?" Julian asked. Lily's face lit up, the tears momentarily forgotten. "He was my best friend," she said with a solemn nod. "After Mommy got sick, he would come to the park. He brought me sandwiches, peanut butter and jelly, with the crusts cut off. He taught me how to draw. We started with squirrels, but they moved too much. So he taught me how to draw trees. He said trees are good at holding still and listening." A bitter lump formed in Julian's throat. His father had never taught him to draw. He had tried once. Julian had been about Lily's age. He remembered the feel of the charcoal, clumsy and foreign in his hand, the frustration of his lopsided circles. His father had been patient, encouraging, but Julian had craved a different kind of lesson. He had wanted to learn about spreadsheets and stock markets, the tangible architecture of power, not the whimsical rendering of a squirrel. He had pushed the sketchbook away and asked for a calculator instead. He'd never seen the disappointment in his father's eyes. Not until now, reflected in the earnest gaze of this strange little girl. "He let you come here? To the house?" Julian asked, trying to reconcile the image of his reclusive father with this new information. "Sometimes," Lily said, her eyes wide with the memory. "When it was raining, he'd sneak me in the back door, through the kitchen. He said the front door was too grumpy. We'd have tea in his studio. He had a special cup for me, with painted violets on it. He said I was his violet, because I showed up in a place no one expected to find a flower." The sentiment was so purely Arthur Croft that Julian could almost hear his father's gentle, rumbling voice. He looked at the girl, really looked at her. She had a smudge of what looked like blue paint on her cheek. Her fingernails were rimmed with dirt, but also with the faint stains of color. She wasn't just a girl who loved a painting. She was a girl who understood it. The realization settled in him, not as a thought, but as a feeling. This wasn't just about a promise. It was about a legacy. His father hadn't left behind a legacy of wealth or power, but of kindness, of peanut butter sandwiches and quiet art lessons. And that legacy was embodied in this fierce, paint-stained child. He stood up, his joints cracking in the silent room. He walked over to the shredder, and with a decisive movement, unplugged its thick industrial cord from the wall. He coiled it up and tossed it into an empty packing crate. The finality of the action surprised even him. Lily watched him, her eyes tracking his every move, her arms still wrapped around the frame. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice a small whisper. "I'm not going to destroy it," Julian said. He looked from the painting to the girl and back again. "But you have to tell me more. You have to tell me everything you know about this painting, about my father." A bargain. That was a language he understood. Every transaction had its terms. Lily seemed to understand as well. A flicker of calculation, of old soul wisdom, crossed her young face. She relaxed her grip on the frame, though she didn't let go completely. "Okay," she said. "But first, can we get it away from the monster?" She patted the silent shredder. Julian allowed himself a small ghost of a smile. "All right," he said. "We'll get it away from the monster, and then you can give me the grand tour." He helped her move the painting, his movements careful, almost reverent. The frame was heavier than he expected. Solid oak, hand-carved, with intricate leaf patterns he'd never noticed before. He felt the texture of the dried oils on the canvas beneath his fingertips, a geography of brush strokes that told a story he was only just beginning to learn how to read. They propped the portrait against a clean, bare wall, and it immediately transformed the space. The woman's sad, hopeful eyes seemed to follow him, questioning. For the first time, Julian didn't look away. He felt a nascent curiosity, a fragile green shoot pushing up through the concrete of his cynicism. He was standing on the precipice of a world he had long ago abandoned, and his guide was an 8-year-old girl named after a flower. He had a feeling that his life, so meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed, was about to become very, very cluttered. And for the first time, the thought didn't fill him with dread. It felt, strangely, like coming home. "Where do we start?" Julian asked, turning to his small, unlikely guide. Lily surveyed the cavernous gallery, her expression serious. She was no longer just a scared child. She was a custodian of memory, a keeper of secrets. "We start where he started," she said, her voice filled with a gravity beyond her years. "His studio." She pointed toward a heavy oak door at the far end of the hall, a door Julian hadn't opened in over 2 decades. He had sealed it off, mentally and emotionally, after his last terrible fight with his father. It was the heart of his father's world, a place Julian had seen as the epicenter of his dad's failures, a chaotic mess of unfinished projects and unrealized dreams. To him, it was a room full of ghosts. To Lily, it was a sanctuary. She walked toward it with an unerring confidence, her small hand reaching for the tarnished brass knob. Julian followed, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He felt like an intruder in his own home. The door creaked open, protesting its long disuse. The air that drifted out was thick with the smell of turpentine, linseed oil, and old paper, the ghost of 1,000 creations. It was the smell of his childhood, a scent he thought he had successfully scrubbed from his memory. The studio was exactly as he remembered it, a controlled explosion of creative chaos. Canvases, in various states of completion, were stacked against every wall. Jars bristling with brushes of every size stood on dusty tables. Books on art history and technique were piled high on the floor, their spines broken, their pages dog-eared. And light, a soft, ethereal northern light, poured in through a massive, floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the overgrown gardens. His father had called it the truth window because it never lied about color. For a moment, Julian was frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sudden, violent rush of memory. He saw his father, a big, gentle man, with paint-flecked hands dabbing at a canvas, his brow furrowed in concentration. He heard his father's low hum, a tuneless melody that had been the constant soundtrack to Julian's early years. He felt the familiar sting of resentment, the child's frustration at being ignored in favor of a piece of painted cloth. But then he saw the room through Lily's eyes. Her face was alight with pure, unadulterated joy. "Look," she breathed, running to a low table cluttered with tubes of paint. "He left them out for me." She picked up a tube of cobalt blue, holding it like a precious jewel. "This is the sky color," she said, turning to him, her eyes shining. "Not the everyday sky, but the sky just after a thunderstorm, when it's so clean you feel like you can breathe it." She moved through the room like a curator in her own private museum. She pointed to a series of charcoal sketches tacked to a corkboard. They were studies of hands, a baby's curled fist, a woman's long, elegant fingers, an old man's gnarled knuckles. "Mr. Arty said hands tell more stories than faces," she explained. "Faces can lie, but hands always tell the truth about what they've held and what they've let go of." Julian stared at the sketches. One of them was of his own hand, from when he was 10. He remembered sitting for it, squirming with impatience, wanting to be outside playing, not stuck in this stuffy room. He had seen it as a pointless exercise. Now he saw the incredible detail, the loving attention his father had paid to the crease of his palm, the shape of his fingernails. It was a portrait of a son his father had desperately wanted to understand. Lily then darted over to a dusty corner behind a massive draped easel. "This is the best part," she whispered conspiratorially. She pulled aside the heavy canvas drop cloth, revealing a small child-sized easel. On it sat an unfinished painting of a squirrel, its tail a fluffy question mark. Next to it was a tiny cup with painted violets, now filled with dried, hardened brushes. "My painting spot," she said with quiet pride. "He said every artist needs their own space, even if it's a small one." Julian knelt, his expensive suit creasing in the dust, and looked at the little setup. His father had created a space just for her, a miniature version of his own. He had nurtured her talent, given her a place to feel safe and important. He had given her the attention and validation that Julian, in his youthful arrogance, had rejected. The jealousy was a bitter, childish pill to swallow, but it was quickly replaced by something else, something softer, a profound sense of loss. He hadn't just lost his father, he had lost the man his father was, a man he was only now beginning to meet. "He talked about me?" Julian asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. He needed to know. He needed to know if he had been a ghost in this room, too. Lily looked up from the little easel, her head tilted. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "he kept a picture of you on his desk." She pointed to the massive, cluttered oak desk that dominated one side of the room. Julian's eyes followed her finger. He saw the photograph tucked between a jar of brushes and a stack of books. It was a picture of him at his college graduation, grinning, holding his business degree like a trophy. He had sent it to his father as a kind of proof, a declaration of his success in a world his father didn't understand. He had always assumed his father had thrown it away. But he hadn't. He had kept it, right in the center of his creative chaos. He said you were very smart, Lily continued, walking over to the desk and looking at the photo. He said you built tall buildings that touched the clouds. He was proud of you. He never told me that, Julian said, his voice thick. Maybe he didn't know the words, Lily said simply, with the effortless wisdom of a child. He said sometimes the most important things are the hardest to say, so he painted them instead. She turned from the desk and looked back at the main easel, the one that was still draped. It was the largest one in the room, positioned directly in the path of the truth window's light. That's where he painted my mommy, she said. He was working on something else, but then he met her, and he said he had to stop everything. He said she had a light inside her that he had to try and catch. Julian looked at the shrouded easel. All these years, he had seen his father as a man who dabbled, who drifted from one hobby to another. But Lily's words painted a different picture. A man of passion, a man who could be so moved by a person's inner light that he would abandon all other work to capture it. Who was this woman? Who was Isabella? Who could inspire such devotion? Tell me about her, Julian said, his voice low. Your mother. Lily walked back to him, her expression turning somber. She was an artist, too, she said, just like Mr. Artie. She used to have her own studio, a small one, above a bakery. It always smelled like paint and baking bread. She painted big, bright pictures, full of colors. Not sad colors like in some of Mr. Artie's paintings. Happy colors, sunshine yellow and fire engine red and grass green. She paused, lost in the memory. She taught me my colors. She used to say, "The world is a coloring book, Lily Pad, and it's our job to fill it in." We used to paint together for hours. It was the best. A shadow passed over her face. But then the fire happened. A fire? Julian echoed. Lily nodded, her eyes fixed on some distant, terrible memory. A bad one. It started in the bakery downstairs. Everything burned. All her paintings. All our stuff. We got out, but she lost everything. All her happy colors. She looked up at Julian, and for the first time, he saw not just a child, but a child who had witnessed profound loss. After the fire, she continued, her voice barely a whisper, she stopped painting. She said the colors had gone out of her. She got a job cleaning offices at night. She was always tired, and then she started coughing. The pieces began to click into place. A brilliant artist, a devastating fire, a descent into poverty and illness, and his father, Arthur, finding this woman and her daughter, a broken soul with a light he still saw, a child with the same artistic spark. He hadn't been her lover. He had been her patron saint, her rescuer, or he had tried to be. And that painting? Julian asked, nodding back in the direction of the gallery. The one of your mother. When did he paint that? Before, Lily said. A long time before, when she still had her colors. She told me Mr. Artie painted it when she was a student. He was her teacher at a community art class. He said she was his best student, a prodigy. He painted it to show everyone the light he saw in her. It was supposed to be for a big gallery show, to launch her career. The story was a classic tragedy. A star on the rise, extinguished before she could truly shine. His father had painted her at the peak of her hope, her potential immortalized on canvas. And that canvas had ended up here, in his dusty, forgotten collection, a secret testament to a life that might have been. Julian felt a pang of something he couldn't name. It was empathy, but it was also a kind of shame. He had built an empire on tangible assets, on brick and steel and numbers on a screen. He had never considered the value of something as intangible as a person's potential, a person's light. His father had. He had spent his life collecting and protecting it. After the fire, Julian asked gently, "Did my father try to help her?" "He tried," Lily confirmed. "He offered her a space here, in his studio. He tried to buy her new paints, new canvases, but she said no. She was too proud, or maybe too sad. She said she couldn't face a blank canvas. It was too much pressure. So Mr. Artie helped in other ways, quiet ways. The peanut butter sandwiches, the drawing lessons in the park, the anonymous fund he must have set up. His father hadn't been a failure. He had been a secret philanthropist of the soul. He had understood that sometimes the greatest help you can offer isn't money, but a moment of your time, a shared silence, a place to feel safe. Julian stood up and walked toward the draped easel. He felt an overwhelming urge to see what his father had been working on, the project he had abandoned for Isabella. His hand hesitated for a moment, then he pulled the drop cloth away. He wasn't prepared for what he saw. It wasn't a landscape or a still life. It was a portrait of him. Not the grinning college graduate in the photograph, but a younger Julian, a boy of about 12, sitting by a window, reading a book. The painting was unfinished. The background was just a rough sketch of color. The hands were barely defined. But the face was rendered with an almost painful precision. He saw the boy's fierce concentration, the slight frown of effort, the cowlick in his dark hair. But it was the eyes that held him captive. In the painted eyes of his younger self, his father had captured a loneliness, a vulnerability, and a desperate yearning that Julian had never known he'd exposed. It was him, the real him. The boy he had been before, he had encased his heart in layers of ambition and cynicism. His father had been painting him from memory, trying to understand him, trying to reconnect with the son he felt slipping away. He had been trying to say the things he couldn't say, just as Lily had suggested. "I see you. I remember you. I love you?" The realization struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled back, his hand going to his mouth. The air in the room was suddenly too thin. All these years he had built a narrative of paternal neglect and disappointment. He had told himself his father didn't understand him, didn't approve of him. But the truth was, right here, in oil and canvas. His father had understood him perfectly. It was Julian who hadn't understood. He had been so busy building his own world that he had failed to see the love that was the very foundation of his father's. A small hand slipped into his. He looked down to see Lily standing beside him, her blue eyes full of a startling empathy. She was looking at the unfinished portrait of him, then back at his face. "It looks like you," she said softly, "but sadder. Mr. Artie said this was his most difficult painting. He said he couldn't finish it until he found the right color for the light in your eyes." Julian let out a shaky breath, the sound of a wall crumbling within him. He sank to his knees, his expensive suit forgotten in the dust of his father's studio. He looked at the portrait of the lonely boy he had been, and for the first time since he was that boy, he felt the sting of tears. He wasn't just purging a house. He had been trying to purge his own heart, and in the process, he had almost destroyed the only thing that could make it whole again. The love of a father, captured in paint, and revealed by the fierce, unwavering loyalty of a little girl named Violet. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling on the dusty floor, the past and present swirling around him. Lily stayed with him, her small hand a warm, grounding presence in his. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions. She simply stood with him, a silent witness to his unraveling. It was a gift of companionship he hadn't realized he was starving for. Finally, he found his voice, though it was rough with unshed tears. "The place in the mountains," he said, looking at her. "The one with the clean air. Do you know its name?" Lily shook her head. "Mommy just called it the Pines. She said there were tall trees that whispered secrets to the wind." It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. For the first time in his professional life, Julian Croft was faced with a problem that couldn't be solved with a hostile takeover or a shrewd investment. This required a different kind of currency, hope, and a willingness to search for a woman who had lost her colors. He stood up, a new resolve solidifying within him. The purge was over. The restoration was about to begin. "All right," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Let's go find your mother." His first call was to his personal assistant, a ruthlessly efficient woman named Carol, whom he paid an exorbitant salary to make problems disappear. For once, however, he wasn't asking her to erase a problem, but to find a person. "Carol," he said, his voice crisp and authoritative, a familiar mask slipping back into place. "I need you to locate a medical facility, a sanitarium, or long-term care home, likely specializing in respiratory illnesses. It's probably called the Pines, or something similar. It will be in a mountainous, rural region, likely within a few hundred miles of the city. The patient's name is Isabella. I don't have a last name." There was a brief professional silence on the other end of the line. "Isabella, no last name. A respiratory facility called the Pines. That's all you have?" Carol's voice was carefully devoid of judgment, but Julian could hear the unspoken questions. "There's a child," Julian added, glancing at Lily, who was now carefully examining the tubes of paint on his father's desk. "Her daughter, Lily, about 8 years old. They may have been part of a community arts program run by my father, Arthur Croft. Check his records. Check everything." "Understood, Mr. Croft. I'll get started immediately." He hung up, feeling the familiar hum of putting his vast resources into motion. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't for profit. It wasn't for power. It was for the small girl who was now trying to unscrew the cap on a tube of cadmium yellow with fierce determination. While Carol worked her magic, Julian and Lily embarked on a different kind of investigation. Led by Lily, they explored the rest of the house, not as a property to be liquidated, but as an archive to be rediscovered. She showed him a loose floorboard in the library, where his father had kept a collection of rare, beautiful stones. He called them Earth Treasures, Lily explained, holding up a polished piece of labradorite that flashed with an inner blue fire. "He said you just have to know how to look, and you can find treasure everywhere." In the kitchen, she pointed out a series of faint pencil marks on a doorframe, marking her own growth. The highest one was dated just 2 months ago, signed with the familiar, elegant script of his father. He had been a part of her life, a constant presence, right up until the end. Julian ran his fingers over the marks, a timeline of a love he had been blind to. Every room held a story, a memory that Lily unlocked. She showed him the worn armchair by the fireplace, where his father would read to her from thick books of fairy tales, his deep voice making the dragons roar and the princesses brave. She showed him the music box that played a sad, sweet Debussy tune, the one his mother used to love. Julian had forgotten its existence entirely. With each revelation, the image of his father shifted, softened, and came into sharper focus. The man he had dismissed as a sentimental eccentric was a man of profound depth and quiet passions. His collections weren't clutter. They were curated pieces of a life richly lived. He hadn't been clinging to the past. He had been honoring it. By late afternoon, Julian found himself feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had learned more about his father in a few hours with Lily than he had in the previous 20 years. They were in the sunroom, a beautiful glass-walled room that his father had filled with an unruly jungle of plants. Julian had planned to tear it down to build a minimalist Zen garden. Now he found himself admiring the way the light filtered through the leaves of a giant fiddle-leaf fig. Lily was perched on a wicker stool, carefully watering a pot of African violets. "He said these ones were my flower family," she said, touching a velvety purple petal. "That's why he called me Violet." His phone buzzed, startling them both. It was Carol. "I think I have something, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice sharp with success. "It wasn't easy. There are dozens of facilities with Pine in the name. But I cross-referenced them with your father's financial records. For the past 6 months, he's been making regular, anonymous donations to a specific place, Pine Crest Sanitarium. It's a low-cost, long-term care facility in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They specialize in treating chronic respiratory conditions like tuberculosis and severe asthma. "Is there a patient named Isabella?" Julian asked, his heart beginning to pound. "There is," Carol confirmed. "Isabella Rossi. She was admitted 7 months ago. Her emergency contact is listed as Arthur Croft. Her file also mentions a daughter, Liliana, currently in the care of social services." The words hit Julian like a punch to the gut. Social services. While Lily had been bravely standing guard over her mother's portrait, she had been a ward of the state. She had likely run away from a group home or a foster family, a tiny fugitive on a mission to protect the last piece of her world. He looked over at Lily, who was now humming softly to the violets. The depth of her courage, her resilience, was staggering. She had navigated a world of loss and uncertainty that would have broken most adults, all fueled by a promise to her mother and the kindness of a man she called Mr. Artie. "Carol," Julian said, his voice low and intense, "get my car ready and book me a suite near that sanitarium, the best one. Also, I need you to contact a lawyer, the best family lawyer in the state. I want you to start proceedings for emergency guardianship of Liliana Rossi, effective immediately." "Guardianship, Mr. Croft?" Carol's professional composure finally cracked, a hint of surprise in her voice. "Yes," Julian said, his gaze fixed on the small girl in the sunroom. "She's with me now, and she's not going anywhere." There was no hesitation, no calculation of the costs or complications. It was a decision made not from his head, but from a part of him he thought had atrophied long ago. His heart. He was Arthur Croft's son, after all, and his father, it turned out, had taught him one final, crucial lesson. Some treasures are not meant to be liquidated. They are meant to be protected at any cost. The drive to the mountains was a blur of winding roads and changing foliage. Julian drove the sleek, silent electric car himself, a machine built for speed and efficiency, yet he kept his pace measured and steady. Lily sat in the passenger seat, which was adjusted to be as high as it could go. For the first hour, she had been quiet, processing the sudden, dramatic shift in her reality. She was no longer a runaway, but a passenger on a mission. Julian had explained everything as gently as he could, that her mother was safe, that they were going to see her, and that until she was well, he would be looking after Lily. He had braced himself for fear or suspicion, but she had simply nodded, her big blue eyes trusting him with a faith that was both humbling and terrifying. Now, as the city gave way to rolling hills and then to the hazy blue peaks of the mountains, she began to open up. She pointed out cloud shapes that looked like animals. She sang snippets of songs her mother had taught her, and she peppered him with questions. Do you know how to build a treehouse? Does your car know how to fly? Is it true that if you wish on the first star you see, it really comes true? Julian, a man who typically dealt in quarterly reports and market projections, found himself trying to answer with a gravity that befitted the questions. I've never built a treehouse, but I imagine we could learn. The car cannot fly, unfortunately. And as for wishing on a star, I think it depends on how much you believe in the wish. Lily seemed satisfied with this. She fell silent for a while, watching the trees flash by. Mr. Artie believed in wishes, she said quietly. He wished he could finish your picture, the one of you as a boy. He said he was waiting for the light to be right. They arrived at Pine Crest Sanitarium as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. The building itself was old, but well maintained, a sprawling stone structure with large windows and wide porches. It had a peaceful, quiet atmosphere, a place of healing. Julian, accustomed to the brutalist architecture of modern hospitals, was surprised by its gentle charm. He felt a wave of gratitude toward his father for finding a place like this for Isabella. He had arranged for a private room for her, paid for the best care, and done it all without any need for recognition. Julian took Lily's hand as they walked up the main steps. Her hand felt impossibly small and fragile in his. He was nervous. He was about to meet the woman from the painting, the woman who had inadvertently turned his life upside down. What would he say to her? How could he explain that he had almost destroyed the portrait she treasured, the one his father had painted to immortalize her spirit? They were met by a kind-faced administrator who had been expecting them. Julian's name, and the legal and financial power it represented, had smoothed the way. They were led down a quiet, sun-drenched corridor to Isabella's room. The door was slightly ajar, and from within they could hear a faint, dry cough. Julian's heart clenched. He squeezed Lily's hand gently. "Are you ready?" he whispered. She nodded, her eyes wide and fixed on the door. He pushed it open. Isabella Rossi was sitting up in bed, propped against a mountain of pillows, a book lying open in her lap. She was painfully thin, her skin pale and translucent, but it was unmistakably her. The same high cheekbones, the same wide, intelligent eyes from the portrait, but the hopefulness in the painting was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. Her hair, the hair his father had painted with such love, was dull and lifeless. She looked up as they entered, her eyes first registering Julian, a stranger in an expensive suit, with a flicker of confusion. Then Her gaze dropped to the small girl standing beside him, and her entire being transformed. "Lily pad?" she whispered, her voice a raw, incredulous rasp. A dam of emotion broke within Lily. "Mommy!" she cried, letting go of Julian's hand and running to the bedside. She scrambled onto the bed and threw her arms around her mother's frail shoulders, burying her face in the thin cotton of her hospital gown. Isabella hugged her back, her eyes squeezed shut, silent tears tracing paths down her hollowed cheeks. She held her daughter as if she were the only anchor in a raging sea, murmuring her name over and over again. "My lily pad, my lily pad." Julian stood in the doorway, a silent, awkward witness to the raw power of their reunion. He felt like an intruder, a voyeur. This moment was sacred, a private world of love and loss that he had no right to be a part of. He was about to retreat, to give them their privacy, but Isabella's eyes fluttered open and met his over Lily's shoulder. There was confusion in them, and fear, but also a glimmer of recognition. "You're Arthur's son," she said, her voice weak but clear. "Julian." Julian nodded, stepping fully into the room. "Yes, I'm Julian Croft." He didn't know what else to say. "I'm sorry. I almost destroyed your portrait. I was a fool who didn't understand his own father." Lily pulled back from her mother's embrace, her face glowing with excitement despite the tears. "Mommy, he saved your picture. The bad man wanted to feed it to a monster machine, but I stopped him, and now he's nice. He brought me here, and he unplugged the monster." Isabella looked from Lily's earnest, beaming face to Julian's stoic one, trying to piece together the incredible story. "My painting," she whispered, her eyes searching Julian's. "Arthur kept it safe?" "He did," Julian confirmed, his voice quiet. "It's at the house. It's safe. I promise." The relief that washed over Isabella's face was profound. It was as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It wasn't just a painting. It was a symbol of a time when her life had been full of color and promise. It was proof that the woman she used to be had truly existed. "Thank you," she said, the words heavy with unspoken emotion. "Arthur, he was so kind. After the fire, I pushed everyone away. I was so ashamed. But he never gave up on me. He found me here. He made sure Lily was looked after. He was," she struggled for the right word, "a good man." "Yes, he was," Julian said, and the words felt true and solid in his mouth for the first time. "A much better man than I ever knew." They talked for hours. Isabella, her voice weak but steady, filled in the gaps of the story. She spoke of her time as Arthur's student, of his boundless encouragement, and his belief in her talent. She described the fire with a dull, distant pain, the way it had stolen not just her work, but her very identity. "When you lose everything you've created," she explained, her gaze distant, "you start to believe you're nothing without it. The canvases were blank, and I felt blank too." She told him how Arthur had found her months later, working as a cleaner, her cough already getting worse. He had begged her to let him help, but her pride had been a fortress. So he had helped in secret, paying for doctor's visits, leaving bags of groceries with her landlord, and most importantly, taking Lily under his wing. "He saw the spark in her," Isabella said, stroking her daughter's hair as Lily dozed against her side. "The same one he'd seen in me. He didn't want it to go out. He was protecting her future, the one I felt I'd lost." Julian listened, and with every word, his understanding of his father deepened. Arthur Croft hadn't been a man living in the past. He had been a man investing in the future, in the most personal and meaningful way possible. He had been a venture capitalist of the human spirit. As evening fell, a nurse came in to tell them Isabella needed to rest. Lily was now fast asleep, curled up on the edge of the bed, one hand clutching her mother's. Julian looked at them, a makeshift family reunited in a sterile hospital room, and felt a fierce, unfamiliar surge of protectiveness. This was his responsibility now. He had inherited more than just his father's estate. He had inherited his father's promises. He gently scooped the sleeping Lily into his arms. She was light as a feather, her breath warm against his neck. "I'll take her," he said to Isabella. "I've booked a suite nearby. She'll be safe with me." Isabella's eyes, clouded with exhaustion and medication, filled with a desperate plea. "You'll take care of her." "I will," Julian said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "And I'll take care of you. My father's lawyers are good, but mine are better. We're going to get you the best doctors, the best treatments, whatever it takes." He saw the flicker of pride, the protest forming on her lips, and he held up a hand. "Don't say no," he said softly. "Don't push me away. Let me do this, for my father and for me." A tear slipped from the corner of her eye and traced a path to the pillow. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. Carrying Lily out of the hospital, Julian felt as though he were carrying something infinitely precious. He tucked her into the plush bed in their hotel suite, her small form almost lost in the vast expanse of white linens. He stood and watched her sleep for a long time, the moonlight from the window illuminating the smudge of blue paint that was still on her cheek. In the space of a single day, his world had been completely reordered. He had walked into his father's house that morning, a solitary king of a sterile, empty empire. He would leave this hotel a guardian, a patron, a son who was finally beginning to understand his own inheritance. He looked out the window at the dark, silent mountains, the pines whispering their secrets to the wind. He thought of his father, of Isabella, of the two portraits, one of a woman full of light, one of a boy full of longing. His father had been trying to capture the light in both of them. He had been unable to finish the portrait of his son, he had told Lily, because he couldn't find the right color for the light in his eyes. Julian finally understood. The light had never been missing. It had just been buried. And a little girl with paint on her cheek and an unshakable belief in promises had been the one to help him find it again.